Good morning or good afternoon, good evening. It looks like people are still joining, but why don't we start in the interest of time? My name is Jamie Boex. I'm the Executive Director of the Local Public Sector Alliance, and I'm glad to be joined by so many of you, including several members of the LPSA Advisory Board, as well as a number of our directors. On behalf of the Alliance, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this first working group meeting of fiscal decentralization and subnational finance. As many of you know, the Local Public Sector Alliance is a global alliance of champions for more efficient and inclusive decentralization and localization. And it was established as a platform for knowledge development and knowledge sharing by practitioners and scholars working on the topic around the world, bringing experts from global organizations, as well as policy practitioners, scholars, government officials, as well as civil society organizations interested in achieving more inclusive, responsive, and efficient development. As LPSA has grown over the past 3 years, we as an organization are also trying to practice what we preach by decentralizing our own organization, by the establishment of a number of regional and thematic working groups to meet the diverse demands of our community of practice, and by making these inclusive working groups the front line of the Alliance. The Subnational Finance Working Group is a product of this effort. The specific objective of this working group is to elevate the debate on the important role played by fiscal decentralization and subnational finance in achieving inclusive governance and sustainable development. In doing so, the working group will aim to keep all of us informed about the latest developments on the fiscal aspects of decentralization, covering the 4 pillars of fiscal decentralization, broadly including the following 4: expenditure assignment and the efficient and accountable management of subnational finances. The second pillar being the promotion of subnational revenue mobilization and the efficient collection of own source revenues, including property taxes. Of course, the third pillar of fiscal decentralization, perhaps the most important in my personal opinion, is the design and implementation of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And the final pillar being to ensure subnational access to borrowing and alternative financing mechanisms. Beyond today being just an introductory meeting, today's meeting will also already dive into the substance of things by discussing subnational borrowing, which is a key part of the 4th pillar of fiscal decentralization. With this background, I'm very pleased to share that 3 leading professionals of subnational finance have agreed to co-chair this working group. Rather than me reading their bios, I will ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly in a moment. The working group's first co-chair is Titilola Akindiende, who is the Executive Director of LOGRI, the Local Government Revenue Initiative, based at the Monk School at the University of Toronto, although Titilola is based herself in London. The second co-chair of our working group is Gundula Loeffler, who is a research fellow at ODI, formerly known as the Overseas Development Institute. And our third co-chair is Elton Staffa, who is a senior expert at NALAS, the network of associations of local authorities in Southeast Europe, based in Skopje, although Elton is based in Albania. I also wanted to give a very brief shout out to Marina Jandreska, who will be helping to coordinate the working group. Titilola, Gundula, and Elton, let me ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves in just a few minutes, and after which I will ask Astrid Haas to moderate the next segment of the meeting. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Maybe I can hand over to Titilola. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. So as Jamie said, my name is Titilola Akindende. I am Executive Director for the Local Government Revenue Initiative, LOGRI. My background is as an economist, and I have over 20 years professional experience, including as a UK government economic advisor and working on international development programs in developing countries. LOGRI is an initiative of the International Center for Tax and Development, ICTD, which is a global leading center for research on issues of tax and development. LOGRI itself, again, as Jamie said, is based at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy of the University of Toronto, and its mission is to support governments in lower income countries to improve revenue generation, in particular from property taxes in ways that promote equity, transparency, and accountability. I welcome you all to today's event and look forward to the discussions. Thank you. Over to you, Gondola.
Thank you, Titilola. Yes, hello, good day, everyone. So my name is Gundula Löffler. As Jamie said, I am a research fellow at ODI, based in London. ODI is a London-based think tank, an independent think tank, working on a wide range of global issues. I myself am based in the Development and Public Finance program, and primarily focusing on intergovernmental finance, and municipal and local finance and revenue. Yes, so I have one leg in we do a mix of research and policy advice, and so I have one leg in academia. I used to be or I used to do a PhD on intergovernmental finance with Paul Smoke, and I now work mostly on policy advice and other issues related to intergovernmental finance. Yes. So previously, I've worked for different development agencies, including GIZ, where I was based in Egypt and in Syria. And so I sort of do this like mix of research and policy advice. Thank you.
Elton.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you and see some of my old friends and also make new ones. I'm Elton, and I work with NALAS. NALAS is a network of local government associations in Southeast Europe. And within NALAS, I cover the portfolio of local government finance and fiscal decentralization. I chair the NALAS task force on fiscal decentralization as well, which is composed of local government experts from all over Southeast, the region of Southeast Europe. And within NALAS, we work quite a lot to support evidence-based policies. We've recently developed also this the NALAS Observatory, which is a kind of online platform and knowledge hub, and a data center, so people can come and generate their own data and make visualizations and so on, but also find the useful information on local government affairs in Southeast Europe. So more or less, these are some of the things that I cover within NALAS in the area of local government finance. And I'm really happy to be here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Astrid, may I hand over to you?
Of course, Jamie. Good day, good morning, good evening, everyone. It's as well echoing the co-chairs of the working group. It's great to see so many familiar faces, people that have worked on this topic for so long. We look forward to a very lively discussion today as we approach the topic of municipal borrowing. Before I do that, for those who don't know me, my name is Astrid. I work as an urban economist, supporting cities on such strategic questions with respect to municipal finances overall, both on the revenue and expenditure side, and now also increasingly on the borrowing side. And I also have research positions at the School of Cities at the University of Toronto, the University of Pretoria African Tax Institute, as well as the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. So without further ado, just a few words on today's topic. I think probably when we talk about subnational finance, particularly subnational finance with respect to developing country cities, I think municipal borrowing is probably the the pillar that we haven't cracked yet. With questions of revenue and expenditure, we generally have a growing amount of evidence of what needs to be done. We face, in many cases, the operational impediments to doing it. But with municipal borrowing, it's a challenge in and of itself, given that the needs, particularly with rapid urbanization, for infrastructure and services are growing way beyond what governments can finance themselves. We also know that investment should ideally take place before people settle, because retrofitting is not only financially, but socially, politically, and socially and politically costly. Yet that also means we need to invest money now that we are essentially also investing for future generations. And raising this money has a lot of, raising this money can be very challenging. This is obviously our infrastructure needs are further exacerbated by the current climate emergency. So the infrastructure that we're putting in now needs to not only be resilient to the impacts of climate change, but we need to make sure that we don't exacerbate and in some ways we contribute to the alleviation of the current climate emergency too, which makes in some cases the current costs of infrastructure even higher. So what we have is the needs to make our cities and other localities livable, productive, and sustainable, which means we need finance for long-term investment. This also means finances, unfortunately, doesn't come for free, so it will need to be repaid somehow. And so we're committing, if we borrow, we're committing future generations who, in some cases don't even have the vote right now, to repaying money over time. So we've got to be extremely prudent in what we borrow for, both in terms of the infrastructure we borrow it for and also in terms of how we pay it back. Now, cities and local governments, particularly in the context that I work in, which is primarily around sub-Saharan Africa, face three major constraints to municipal borrowing. That's the legislative constraint. In many cases, they're just simply not allowed to borrow. There is the constraint of the financial health of their own balance sheets, their own creditworthiness. And then there's the ability to put together a pipeline of projects that can attract this finance. And so the question becomes, what then? And so this is this is the discussion that we look forward to having with you today. And to enter this discussion, we're going to have two presentations. The first, based on a paper that has recently been published, written by Gundula and co-authored by myself, where we look at the potential of subnational financial intermediaries in helping unlock this potential finance for urbanization in developing countries. And then the second speaker for today, who many of you know very, very well, is has a very illustrious background and career and sits with me as well on the board of directors for the LPSA, is Professor Paul Smoke, who's the Professor of Public Finance and Planning at NYU. His research and policy interests include urban and regional development, political economy, and fiscal reform, and public sector decentralization. He's also taught at MIT and worked as a resident policy advisor at the Harvard Institute for International Development in Kenya and Indonesia, and has a very, very long CV that I'm sure that you'll be able to find. Probably most of you know anyway, but otherwise we'll be able to find. And so we don't want to, with much further ado, we don't want to spend too much time on introductions, but let me hand over to Gundula for the first presentation. So the format this will take Gundula will present on the subnational financial intermediaries paper. Paul will then present on subnational borrowing and commercial debt in lower middle income countries. And then I will introduce our discussant, David Painter, after that. And following the remarks from our discussant, we'll open it up to overall discussion. from the working group. So Gundula, can I hand over to you, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Astrid. Well, first of all, apologies for my slight distraction during the introduction. I will be more focused from now on. I will start by sharing my presentation with you. All right. Now, where's the mouse?
Gundula, are you able to put it in
Yeah,
presentation
I'm
mode?
looking for, here we go.
There we go.
All right. All right, you can all see this?
Yes,
Excellent.
we can. Thanks.
Well, thank you. All right. So thank you, Astrid. So today I want to present to you a piece of research that I have conducted together with Astrid, my co-author, and with the kind collaboration of the FMDV on financial intermediaries for facilitating cities' access to debt finance in Africa. Just briefly on the motivation for this research. As you will all be aware, cities and local governments in Africa face a considerable infrastructure gap, which is growing continuously due to a number of issues, fast progressing urbanization, climate change, and other regional and global challenges, such as conflicts, pandemics, etc. So despite this increasing pressure that this puts cities and local governments in Africa, the vast majority of them do not have direct access to financial markets that would allow them to make infrastructure investments from debt finance. Instead, they mostly rely on intergovernmental transfers or development grants from development partners. However, we also know that municipal access to debt can be facilitated through certain institutions, usually referred to as financial intermediaries. So in our research, we sought to shed some light on these institutions by proposing a definition and a typology of financial intermediaries and exploring the type of institutions that are prevalent on the African continent. So before we dive into the gist of the research, just a quick reminder of the main obstacles that prevent the majority of African cities and local governments from accessing private debt. The obstacles are numerous and can be grouped into 4 buckets. Obstacles related to the legal and regulatory framework of the respective country, obstacles related to the performance and practices of the cities and local governments, those obstacles related to the investment projects proposed by cities and local governments, and last but not least, obstacles related to the domestic and regional financial markets. Now, financial intermediaries can address at least some of these obstacles in one way or another, thus helping cities and local governments gain access to debt finance. Interestingly, financial intermediaries can come in many different legal and institutional forms and structures and can draw on a wide range of different financial sources. They can also offer various financial and non-financial instruments to facilitate borrowing. Sometimes these institutions can look so different that they are hardly recognizable as aiming for the same objective, which is to help cities and local governments gain access to longer-term debt for infrastructure financing. So based on that common objective, we have proposed a fairly broad definition of the term, which reads as follows. A financial intermediary for cities' access to finance is an institution, public or private, that facilitates access to capital investment finance for cities and local governments by way of creating better than market conditions for the debtor. Furthermore, given this great diversity of institutions that can be subsumed under the umbrella of financial intermediaries, we also want to propose a typology along 2 dimensions. The first dimension relates to the institutional setup of the financial intermediary, including its ownership and legal and organizational structure. And the second dimension relates to the sources of financing that the financial intermediary draws on. We will look at each of those in turn. With regards to the institutional setup, the figure you can see here maps the ownership and legal status of the different types of financial intermediaries. According to the logic proposed here, financial intermediaries can be owned either by the governments of the countries whose cities and local governments are being supported, can be owned by the development assistance community, by the private sector, or they can be co-owned by any combination of these three groups. In terms of their legal status, financial intermediaries can be public or private entities. This is often a simple function of their ownership structure, but can also constitute a deliberate attempt at exploiting specific advantages or incentives inherent to a particular legal form. Among the government-owned financial intermediaries, we have, of course, the national and municipal development banks and agencies, as well as specialized units within ministries. However, under certain circumstances, municipally owned companies can also function as financial intermediaries, as can so-called special purpose vehicles, or SPVs, that can be set up at every level of government, as well as with any ownership configuration. Regarding financial intermediaries owned by the development assistance community, these include primarily certain programs or projects by bilateral donor agencies and banks, but there are also some very few donor-owned companies that can act as financial intermediaries. Owned by the private sector, there are philanthropic foundations that can, under certain circumstances, act as financial intermediaries, as well as certain mission-based capital investment firms. Among the co-owned institutions, we primarily see certain programs and projects of regional and multilateral organizations and development banks, as well as specialized global and regional associations and networks. Here, one noteworthy thing about the bi- and multilateral development partners is that their programs and projects can function either as a first floor institution, where they provide direct support to cities and local governments, or as second floor institutions, where they provide their support indirectly by channeling it through other financial intermediaries, such as national or municipal development banks or agencies. On the second dimension, related to the financing sources, the figure shows a large number of sources of upstream financing that the financial intermediaries can potentially draw on based on their provenance. A main source of financing comes, of course, from government budgets, either from domestic or donor governments. These usually come in the form of one-off or recurrent budget allocations to either national or municipal development banks or agencies in the case of domestic budgets, or to development agencies or banks for projects in the case of donor budgets. Member country contributions from government budgets to go to multilateral organization development banks are also included. Where bilateral and multilateral or multilateral development partner projects act as second floor institutions, they can channel financing sources through other financial intermediaries in the form of grants, concessional or non-concessional loans, and sometimes even equity. And then with regard to private sector financing, domestic and international financing, financial markets offer bonds, non-concessional loans, and equity that can be tapped by certain financial intermediaries. High net worth individuals and companies can make donations, for example, to foundations, or invest some of their capital through financial intermediaries. Now, when examining the landscape of financial intermediaries in Africa through the lens of this typology, the following pattern emerged. We see that financial intermediaries in government ownership, such as national and municipal development banks and agencies, are most common, across Africa by far. Examples of these are the FEC in Morocco, the DBSA in South Africa, DFLA in Malawi, and so on. These institutions vary greatly in size, mandate, and capacity, and many of them are heavily dependent on recurrent budget allocations or on donor funds. Municipally owned companies acting as financial intermediaries, on the other hand, are not very common, as only a small number of them are sufficiently creditworthy to access private financing. Examples of this are some of the county-owned water companies in Kenya, for example, or the Tanga Urban Water Supply and Sanitation Authority in Tanzania. Special purpose vehicles, while attracting some interest, are also still quite rare in practice, where they exist, they do so mostly at the project level. One example that is currently in the process of being set up is the Blue Peace Initiative in Freetown, which aims to help the city acquire private funding to set up water kiosks. In most cases, cities draw on technical assistance for setting up those SPVs. With regards to financial intermediaries in developing assistance ownership, projects by bilateral development partners play an important role in Africa and will likely continue to do so in the foreseeable future. The main donors active in this space are the AFD, KfW, EU, USAID, SIDA, and others. However, to date, most of them continue to channel their funding through central government. Many of them also show a strong interest in investing in cities and local governments directly. However, in practice, this has proved to be quite challenging due to institutional restrictions within those institutions. Donor-owned companies, such as the Private Infrastructure Development Group, PIDG, or its subsidiary Garantco, are still quite rare, a rare occurrence, and operate mostly outside of Africa, although Garantco, for example, has recently provided a guarantee to secure the water bond issued by Tanga Uwasa in Tanzania. Financial intermediaries owned by the private sector are also not very common just yet in Africa. We've seen some few projects financed by philanthropic foundations, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but these institutions continue to engage primarily with central government institutions rather than cities and local government directly. So-called mission-driven capital investment firms are also quite rare, and their investment volumes in African cities, where they do happen, are still quite modest. One example to watch out for going forward is maybe the Urban Resilience Fund International Municipal Investment Fund, managed by the French infrastructure investment firm Meridiam, who have partnered with UNCDF, UCLG, and FMDV to help with city engagement and early stage project pipeline identification and development. Then with regards to financial intermediaries co-owned by government and development assistance community, projects by multilateral development organizations and banks are of great importance in Africa, but they tend to face similar challenges and restrictions as the bilateral development ones. So some examples of key players are the World Bank, UNCDF, and of course the African Development Bank with their Urban Municipal Development Fund. Global and regional associations and networks, such as FMDV, UCLG, C40 cities, and others, focus primarily on technical assistance to facilitate access to infrastructure financing for cities and local governments, but they tend to be mostly donor financed. While quite present in Africa, they can probably not keep up with demand. And then finally, financial intermediaries co-owned by government and the private sector usually come in the form of project level SPVs, and they're still quite rare in Africa, maybe with the exception of South Africa. After examining the landscape of financial intermediaries as it currently manifests itself in Africa, we identified also a number of crucial gaps in the offer of cities access to debt finance. The most glaring one is likely that the volume of accessible financing for cities and local governments continues to be much too small to address the enormous infrastructure needs that exist. Also, many municipal development funds or agencies still rely heavily on issuing grants rather than loans, which gives little chance for cities and local governments to build a track record of municipal borrowing. This also means that these organizations themselves, these financial intermediaries themselves, don't build up their own experience with issuing loans, which might entail different considerations from issuing grants. Another gap is that most local governments across Africa still have no access to debt finance at all, which leaves them in a catch-22 situation where no one is going to lend to them if they can't show that they've managed debt before. Another gap, then we've observed a lack of investment vehicles at the state and national levels that could facilitate blended and private finance for urban infrastructure investment. As mentioned, such institutions currently exist primarily at the project level, but this might not be enough to attract and accommodate a greater volume of this type of financing. We also see insufficient support for cities and local governments to realize their potentially bankable project ideas. So far, only the most proactive cities manage to obtain technical assistance to turn their project ideas into realizable projects. To reach the many more that are potentially out there, support in this area needs to be ramped up. And then last but not least, there are important gaps in many of the legal and regulatory frameworks for municipal borrowing of many African countries, which need to be addressed so as to ensure a healthy balance between managing risk of sustainable borrowing, of subnational borrowing on the one hand, and creating an enabling environment that allows cities and local governments to access debt finance on the other. So based on these observed gaps, our research also articulates a number of policy recommendations, which you can read about in the paper. I will put the link to the publication in the chat. So I thank you for your attention. I hope I stayed on time. And I will hand back to Astrid. Thank you.
Thanks, Gundula, very much on time. That was very impressive. Thank you very much. We will, Mihaly, I've seen your question in the chat, but before we get to the questions, I'm going to actually hand over to Paul first to do his presentation, and then we'll take, and after David has discussed it, we'll take a round of questions after that, but we've taken note of that. So Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Astrid. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. It's just maybe in presentation mode. Would that be possible?
Sure. It's just it's always hard to find it on here because of the there we go.
There we go. Yep, perfect.
Okay, thanks. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, everybody. And thanks for asking me to do this. Just a little bit of context. I started working on subnational borrowing in the 1980s when I worked on the now long defunct Kenya Local Government Loans Authority and similarly departed regional development account in Indonesia. So I've been playing around with this for a long time, but I didn't work that much on subnational borrowing for a while. And a few years ago, the Asian Development Bank Institute asked me to look at a paper on subnational development finance, which I did. And the International Finance Corporation saw that and asked me to help them think about what was going on with commercial borrowing. So what I'm going to present today is a little bit of a mishmash of things I've been doing the last few years. And just a caveat, of course, as we've already seen from Gundula and Astrid's paper, this is a very complicated area. The data are really weak and hard to compare. So we take everything with a grain of salt. And what I'm going to present to you is relatively superficial, unfortunately, but I don't have that much time. So I changed the title to Towards a Pragmatic Framework for Improving Subnational Government Development Finance and Increasing the Appropriate Use of Borrowing. And why is this thing? Oh, there we go. Okay. So I think most of this has already been covered, that the subnational finance sources for development are transfers and debt. Transfers dominate. And much of the subnational government borrowing in developing economies is concessional. And a lot of it flows through sovereign financial arrangements with ministries of finance and the kinds of special intermediaries that Gundula was just talking about. My big point today is that transfers and concessional lending are probably in many countries used more than is necessary, and or they're inappropriately targeted. And by that, I don't mean to downplay at all the points that Gundula just made about the lack of finance and so forth. But in many countries, there are at least some cities and bigger local governments that could be going to the market and freeing up transfers and concessional borrowing for the places that can't go to the market. And so I think that's one of the things that the IFC wanted to explore in the paper I'm working on for them, which I'd be happy to share with people when it's done. And they were interested, particularly in that paper, in focusing more on the middle income countries where commercial borrowing is more probable. And not only does that mean that transfer and subsidized loans could go to fiscally weaker local governments in those countries, but it means that some of the donor resources that now go to places that don't need them in countries where there are cities that could be borrowing commercially, more of that money could go to the fiscally weaker countries, the countries where commercial borrowing is not allowed. And oh, there it goes. Okay, so we see, I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but we see that subnational government debt as a share of total government debt is definitely less in upper middle and lower income countries. Yet investment is fairly comparable, except in the lowest income category. So local governments are not borrowing much, but they're investing a fair amount of the total government investment portfolio, which means, of course, that they're getting transfers. And across all categories, intergovernmental transfers are a fairly common share of total revenue. So it means that to some extent, the richer countries are not necessarily using these for investment purposes. They're using them for other purposes. Now, we looked at 14 middle income countries, and what we found is that, and there are a few anomalies here, the data for 2020 probably captures some of the issues from the pandemic, but there's consistently a set of middle income countries where there's very little borrowing compared to others. So these are the ones in green, and they have considerably lower shares of total public debt. And in these same countries where there's little borrowing, most of the borrowing that goes on, again in green, is concessional. So why is subnational government borrowing limited in these middle income countries? Do these places have fewer functions and smaller fiscal roles in the public sector? Do they have limited access to development finance because of weak domestic financial sector development? Are they at a disadvantage or get unfavorable borrowing terms because they have weak sovereign credit ratings? Or do they have constraints because there isn't a national borrowing framework? Well, in these countries, I mean, many of those things exist, of course, in developing countries, but in most of these countries, the low borrowing countries among this group that we looked at, they actually play a fairly major role. and an even more major role in capital expenditures. And all of them fall above the IMF's emerging market financial development index benchmark for emerging economies. Most of them have investment grade credit rating. Now, this is sovereign credit rating, but the IFC's research shows that the biggest cities, the most fiscally sound local governments in many of these countries, their credit rating is comparable to the sovereign credit rating, and all of them have subnational borrowing frameworks. So some of these things that Gundula pointed out as being an issue, definitely in lower income countries, aren't really an issue here in this superficial way. So what else might be affecting this? Well, what we discovered when we looked into this is that some of the subnational borrowing frameworks aren't sufficiently developed, or they're not rule-based. There's a lot of arbitrariness in making decisions. Some of the countries are dominated by these public or concessional lending options that may crowd out commercial borrowing, even when some of the bigger places could do it. There are secondary regulations that make local governments jump through a lot of hoops, and therefore they're less likely to want to go through the hassle of borrowing. And there are some cases where multiple national government agencies have to approve subnational borrowing, which makes it more difficult both for the borrower and the lender. So, of course, if you move beyond these basics, and Gundula has already pointed this out, there are issues in the intergovernmental fiscal framework that can constrain subnational spending and revenue generation. If there's not much autonomy, if a lot of the spending that's going on is being mandated, if the subnational governments don't have much control over their own sources of revenue, if the transfers are conditional and can't be used, for example, for debt service. So there are other things in the larger intergovernmental fiscal framework that can dampen borrowing. Implementation is an issue. You can have a great framework that people mess with in its implementation. And then, of course, there are accountability mechanisms, and a lot of this has to do with upward accountability. In my own experience, I saw a lot of instances where national governments did not make subnational governments repay subnational financial intermediaries for political reasons. But there's also downward accountability reasons. Do citizens know what local governments are supposed to be providing for them, what they should be investing in, and are they placing demands on them? So where this takes me is that I think we need to recognize that the countries I was just looking at were mostly middle-income countries, and only a couple of them are in Africa. But there's so much diversity across and within countries that we need tailored approaches. Creditworthy subnational governments need access to capital markets with appropriate regulation. They should not be getting grants and subsidized loans for sub-financing projects where those resources could be used for poorer local authorities to invest in infrastructure. Less creditworthy subnational governments need other options, like these subnational government financial intermediaries that Gundula was talking about. And the fiscally weakest ones, they're going to still continue to get transfers, but there are ways, and we've seen them, where mechanisms and incentives can be instituted to try to help even fiscally weaker local governments to begin to borrow a bit for a project which begins to establish their creditworthiness. And so what I think we need to be thinking about in terms of development finance is looking at the type of investment, whether it's self-financing, partially revenue generating, or non-revenue generating social purpose, and the creditworthiness, the fiscal state of a local government, low, medium, or high. And in the case of a non-revenue generating social purpose project, a low fiscal capacity government might get only transfers. But for a self-financing project in a high credit-worthy country, they should be going to the market as much as possible. And then there's a whole mix of things in other parts of the categories. So I think this is the direction we need to move in, thinking about the overall landscape of development finance, the overall state of the fiscal state of subnational governments, and how to develop a spectrum of instruments that meet development investment needs. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think that complements the discussion very well, because I'd actually not thought about the sort of the crowding out effect with the finance for those countries who could actually be borrowing, and then sort of the concessional finance either way. So I think that will open up a very nice discussion. Before we do open it up, I just want to invite David Painter, who's our discussant today. David has more than 40 years of experience in public and private sector urban infrastructure financing, including 25 years with the USAID Foreign Service. He has advised organizations such as the Woodrow Wilson International Center, SECO, the World Bank, and the Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility, City Alliance, amongst others. So David, I'm very excited to hear what your thoughts are on the two presentations. And for the rest of the working group, please do start thinking about the questions. We're going to open it up after David's comment. And if you have some questions already, please feel free to put them in the chat. David, over to you.
Thank you, Astrid. And first of all, let me say thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this. This is quite a high-powered group. Certainly the audience as well has got a lot of people who are doing extraordinary work. And it's very, very important work, by the way. I am going to kind of look at this a little bit from the direction of a practitioner, as opposed to Paul and Gunilla, who come at this from the standpoint of researchers. And that's only because of the fact that that's all I've done. I haven't ever done any significant research in this kind of area. But over the years, watching what's happened with development finance for especially in developing countries, whether they be medium to high income countries or medium low and lower, I think there's one key thing that needs to be emphasized, and I was very glad to see that both of the presenters put a great stress on this, and that is that the key is going to be increasing the volume of financing available to local governments and city governments. I would add to it, from my perspective as a practitioner, that this means increasing the market-based, I'm going to say market-based as opposed to private sector, simply because it doesn't mean that the public sector can't do market-based financing. Market-based financing, which is done in local currency, that's, to my mind, the thing that really needs to be advanced as far as possible. Why is that? I'm not going to harp on my usual hobby horse, which some of you may have heard if you see me in other contexts about local currency, simply to say that borrowing hard currency at the level of local government is simply courting disaster and has been. Sorry,
David,
we somehow got muted. I hope I didn't. Did I miss out too much?
No, just it ended at disaster, so it was a very dramatic.
Okay, yes, disaster. And when I think of disasters, I'm thinking of borrowings by Buenos Aires, for instance, which brought down when they borrow hard currency and are unable to repay it, brings down the governments in Argentina. But the similar types of things have happened in places like Poland and Russia and elsewhere, mostly, especially the middle-income countries and upper middle-income countries, because of the fact that international markets probably wouldn't touch anything else. But it is really a serious issue, and one that I'm not going to harp on. But what is really important here is that it's this market-based financing that is crucial. If you can't expand that, you're really not going to expand the volume of lending to the local governments and city governments. And that is simply because there's just not enough funds in the donor community or in national governments that's going to be available for use by cities. I'm going to go to cities, but drop local governments for the moment. But cities just aren't going to have the resources. They just aren't going to be there, literally. But if you can open it up, and if you can get market-based financing, especially from the local capital markets, and that may mean national capital markets in some places, but it could also mean regional capital markets if you have a regional currency. And I'm thinking now of the CFA zone, for instance, in West Africa. So this is the direction from which I'm coming. I want to first of all say that I entirely agree with turning to Gundula's presentation, I entirely agree with her statement of the problems involved as well as the obstacles involved. I would take a little bit of an exception with her, not with her typology work, but with her definition, which ends with the words, by creating better than market conditions for the debtor. If that's all that the financial institutions are going to do, it's going to have, in fact, an unintended consequence of discouraging market-based lending. And that's something you don't want to do if that's what you want to expand. So the thing that I would suggest in the context of her presentation, and I know the paper's out, but in further discussions of it, and would be to de-emphasize that last phrase about creating better than market conditions, unless by that you simply mean access. But if you mean that they're going to be given special treatment in some way with lower interest rates or with other concessions, that is what keeps the market-based financing out of the game. And from an institutional standpoint, I would say that market lenders, whoever they are not going to bother to develop the expertise they will need in order to make loans to city governments if they believe they are always going to be crowded out every time they look at such a venture by some financial institution, whether it's government owned or donor owned, doesn't really matter. But if they're being crowded out because their market terms are undercut by those financial institutions, they won't play in that game and they will walk away. And that is a large part what has happened not only in Africa, but in many other places. So I think that the important point here is perhaps if you can recall, or when you go back and look at the final slide in Gundula's presentation, there was bullet number 1, and that was the key point about trying to expand the volume of available resources for lending to city governments. And I would say that, so that therefore, in many respects, the question that follows from Gundula's work is how can financial institutions of the kind she's talking about increase the volume of financing being done by tapping into market rate financing for those cities and local governments that they're intended to serve. So those are briefly my comments on Gundula's presentation. I don't want to take a lot more time. Paul's presentation, I by the way, agree strongly with, as you might have guessed. His points are exactly on the mark, in my view, in terms of the problem of concessional lending. Concessional lending, which is, as he points out, probably greatly overused, has the implication that market-based lenders are simply not going to get into the game. If you don't get them into the game, they never learn how to do it. If they don't know how to do it, they're going to be very risk averse. in terms of getting into it. So if you want to get them in, you have to address the whole question of the concessionality of other credits that they have to compete against. Remember, they have to compete. They're in the business of making money for the most part. Certainly the private ones are. And if they can't figure out how to make money at it, they aren't going to touch it. So it's going to be important that you address the question of crowding out that was raised by Paul's presentation. Another point that Paul raised that I'm going to take a little bit of exception to is the question about lending, should really be focused on the creditworthy subnational governments. And that's true, but I don't think it necessarily has to be limited to that, in the sense of this, that what's really important is that the transaction for the financing is creditworthy. And there are a lot of ways to do that. In the United States, there are, for instance, in not only the US, but also in India, and this has been demonstrated in Mexico, and it can be done in other upper middle income countries relatively easily. But as you move down, it may be more and more complicated. But the issue really is the financing transaction itself creditworthy? If it is, then you're going to be able to find market-based lenders and investors who are going to want to take part in it. If it isn't, they won't. It's as simple as that, really. So that is where you come into the question of, could the donor community and the development institutions utilize credit enhancements, credit guarantees of various sorts, arguably not 100% guarantees, but partial credit guarantees, as a way of demonstrating that, we can lower the risk a little bit for you in the private and market-based sector to do the lending, learn about it. We'll do the first 5, we'll do the first 10. After that, we're out, and you should know enough about this game that you can stay in it and make good money at it. So that is one of the things that I think is important. Another way of coming at that was used in Mexico by a group that I know rather well. They simply found ways to arrange for what they would call armor plating the revenue stream that is going to go toward repayment of debt. If there's a way of making sure that revenue stream is dedicated to repayment, and no one in the political side, either at the local level or at the national level, can touch it, then you're going to find that the investment community in the market side are going to become rather interested. Most of the kind of financing that was done that way in Mexico was tremendously oversubscribed and usually beat the prevailing market rates, which involved no armor plating for the revenue stream. And that would be a way also of finding a way of making the transaction, and it doesn't matter whether it's a loan or a bond, but simply the transaction in whatever form, creditworthy and therefore of interest to the market-based lending and investing community. I'm going to stop there. I think those are the basis of my my major comments. So I'll turn it over and we'll be very interested to hear the rest of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, David. Some very interesting comments that I'll also ask Gundula and Paul to respond to. But we've also had some great questions and comments in the chat. So I am going to ask, so Mahali's is a more of a technical comment for Gundula as to why water companies are included as financial intermediaries. So I think that one, Gundula, you'll be able to cover that. Grace, do you want to just quickly summarize your question around creditworthiness, because I think this is a very good question in terms of, you know, even if the supply of finance is there, how do we increase the demand? And then Deborah, I'm going to ask you to please also bring in your question about the current debt crisis and how this is impacting. And then we'll take another round of questions after that. So Grace and then Deborah.
Yes, okay, good afternoon. The summary of my question is I'm asking if the creditworthiness is not the key factor, primarily because the subnational governments have really to be creditworthy before we can say the law is limiting them. You can have the law that is not limiting them, but they are not creditworthy. Hence, the risk for countries that have a high debt rate, and also for the countries that the subnational governments don't have adequate revenue to service debt. Hence, cannot be the key primary for those type of countries. Hence, I'm asking, how do we manage subnational governments that are not creditworthy against expecting them to be able to get debt, which might compromise the nation? Thank you.
Yes, and that affects a lot of subnational governments, particularly in low-income countries. So great question, Grace. Deborah?
Okay, thank you.
Hi, everyone, and fine to call me Debbie. Thanks for the excellent presentations. Very interesting and useful to get an update on where this field is. As previously noted, there's a number of old timers on the chat and in the meeting. And one of the things that's complicating this discussion about subnational finance at the moment is that what we've seen in the past year or two is actually a buildup over time, a real explosion in debt sustainability, particularly in Africa, but in many other parts of the world. And so many people look at this and say, okay, we're going back into another debt crisis a la the 1980s. Do we need another HIPC initiative? This is central governments. It's motivated or driven in part by many countries going to private bond markets for borrowing, but also by new players in the lending game, China in particular. And in the past, when we sought to resolve this, the Paris Club was brought together, national debt was sorted out, frameworks were put in place. And even after those resolutions, we had difficulty moving subnational borrowing forward. I guess my question to the speakers is, is there any sense of what the implications of the current debt issues might be for subnational debt at the moment? And particularly to Paul, as you're doing this work right now, do you see any lessons from the 1980s and that whole experience, the past 30 years for the next 30, so to speak? Are there things that we might do differently to help us support subnational entities in financing their infrastructure? So I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Debbie. I think I'm just also realizing time. So actually, I'm going to go around all the questions that are there and ask Paul and Gundula to respond to them at once. So there's actually two comments as well, which I think are interesting. So Antonio mentioned that in the Philippines, one of the barriers to the participation of private banks in the subnational credit market is the requirements that are set by national government that only government banks can be depository banks of subnational governments. So I think this is a sort of interesting institutional barrier. And then there's obviously Mahali makes a great point. One of the biggest barriers that we also particularly face in the African context, we only have to think of the car municipal bond experience, is that cities are political and they're political beasts and often opposition to national governments, and this creates political risk as well. But there's a final question in the chat. Chaz, do you want to just pose your question as well, and then I'll hand back to Paul and Gundula?
Sure. Really liked Paul's data on the different country um, practices, but I guess if there is subnational debt being issued, what do we learn from who's borrowing it? Is it different in each country? Is it domestic? Is it foreign? Which gets to the political risk and legal risk, I guess, that is individual, I suspect, country to country.
Great. So Paul and Gundula, can I give you a few minutes each just to sort of respond collectively to the questions and comments that were there before we move to the next part of the meeting? Paul, let me start with you, and then I'll go to Gundula after.
Sure. Oh my gosh, these are all great comments and questions and hard to answer. Let me try to speed dial through this. On the first question, I think that the way to build creditworthiness is to force even weaker local governments to take a small loan. I think there should be linkages between grants and loans, where part of many, not all, but many infrastructure projects could be financed by a partial loan that is tied to revenues that would have to be used to repay the loan. Once they do that, there's a possibility that they're starting to establish creditworthiness. And this is actually an idea that's been floating around for a long time. There are some subnational financial intermediaries that mix grants and loans, but not in a systematic way. It's like 30% loan and 70% grant or something like that. But I think it needs to go back to that table that I had at the end of my presentation, where the mix of grants and loans depends on the fiscal state of the local government and the nature of the development project. Let's see, Debbie's question. Debbie, I think that I haven't really thought about the 1980s issue. I'll ask the IFC guys and get back to you about that, what they think. But I do think that part of it gets back to needing to separate these special financial intermediaries that are needed so much in many low and middle income countries more from the government, and making them somewhat more independent, where they're not so much part of the overall national public debt, and can be more managed. I mean, we know from the limited evidence on these things that the more that non-governmental private sector actors are involved in the management and funding of these things, the better they work. And so I think that's something that we should be thinking more about. And from what I'm seeing, what some of the donors are doing, they're not getting that message. On Chaz's point, Chaz, it's kind of all over the place. In some countries, most of the borrowing is done at the intermediate tier. Like in Pakistan, it's entirely the provinces. In other cases, it's more municipal, but it's almost always the big cities. I mean, in South Africa, nearly 90% of all the borrowing is done by the metros. And so it's hard to say exactly who's borrowing, but most of it is domestic. We found very little evidence of loans in foreign currency, and in fact, in many of the countries that I had on the screen, it's not allowed for subnational governments to borrow in that way. They're almost all revenue attached. So infrastructure projects, I've seen very little general revenue bonds for examples. So I think the bottom line is that it just points back to the need for looking at the context of a particular country, seeing what's happening and what the issues are, and what that implies for policy options. And I don't know if I missed anything, but I've been talking for a long time, Astrid, so maybe I better shut up and let Gundula take the floor.
Thanks, Paul. Gundula, I'm going to hand over to you, and then I'm actually going to ask you just to continue to facilitate towards the end of the session, because you're taking over the facilitation of the next piece as well. So over to you.
All right, thank you, Astrid. Yeah, so maybe I can start by responding to one of the comments that David made in his discussion, which is explain a little bit the logic for why I included the better than market conditions into, we included better than market conditions into the definition. I mean, at the end of the day, this is what's essential about the financial intermediaries, right? That they actually provide these conditions that actually help those local governments and cities that are not able to access financing from the financial markets because they just simply can't afford it, right? So they need those better than market conditions in order to get that. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be concessional lending. It can also be these conditions can also include, for example, providing guarantees for a loan or other credit enhancement mechanisms. It can also include even technical assistance that comes for free or at a very reduced price that would otherwise have to be bought in for a lot of money. That would help structure the deal financially or prepare the project from a technical viewpoint. All these things effectively reduce the cost of the investment and the debt, and therefore would qualify as such, as sort of better than provide, creating conditions that are better than market, meaning better than having to buy this from the private sector, purely from the private sector. I of course fully agree with you that by making that such offering, you have the risk that that cities will turn away from just going to the private sector altogether, or to the financial markets altogether, because they can get it for cheaper. I mean, this crowding out effect also that Paul referred to. But I think one way to get around that is by as Paul also suggested in his presentation, to limit access to these better than market conditions for local governments that are actually capable of accessing financial markets directly, and doing so also by creating incentives for local governments to actually improve their capacity and sort of graduate from being a beginner borrower to a fully fledged professional borrower who can get money on market conditions. So this also requires, of course, this is why I think that developing the legal and regulatory framework and doing it in a smart way that sets incentives right is very key here. But just to say again that these better than market conditions are actually a core element of what constitutes, in our understanding anyway, those financial intermediaries. But obviously they should only help those local governments that actually need it. Then on Mihali's point, thank you for the questions. On the Kenya water companies, I mean, as I said, obviously, I mean, water companies are not meant to be, their function is different, of course, from being primarily a financial intermediary, but in our understanding, they can function as such, as they are the ones that can actually access private debt, maybe a little bit too much. I mean, and recent studies have also worked by PF, for example, have shown that some of the water companies in Kenya that are now under county ownership are actually over indebted and therefore cannot borrow anymore. But at least at some point, some of them are capable of accessing infrastructure loans that the counties themselves maybe you wouldn't be able to access. This is sort of the logic behind, but including those as financial intermediaries. Yeah, if you think that we got the fine technicalities wrong, then please, happy to discuss that further. And on your second point around the importance of politics and all of that, I mean, I couldn't agree more. This is definitely a very important aspect, which yeah, we didn't really raise that much in these short presentations, but and yeah, we'll hopefully emphasize it a little bit more in the paper. But yes, important point. And then to Grace's question regarding creditworthiness. So I've spoken to experts for this research who say that creditworthiness is really only comes at the very end of this whole process. This is about building their experience or the capacity of local governments to learn how to become creditworthy. So also, it's not like sort of like a fixed threshold at which once you pass a certain level, you're suddenly creditworthy. It's also often in the eye of the lender, how much security they want to have and how sure they want to be about, or how much risk they want to take with the money that they're lending to local governments. So in a way, if we wait for all local governments to become creditworthy, they will never get there. They need to practice, and they need to sort of slowly do so also through what Paul mentioned, these sort of grant loan mixes, where even local governments that are technically not creditworthy, according to some matrix, they still they get a chance to take on loans and get to learn how to manage those and demonstrate that they are able to pay them back. And again, the legal and regulatory framework needs to also, request or insist that those local governments also, provide certain or follow certain rules and make certain payment or transactions transparent. That will sort of help with building their creditworthiness. But it's not something I think that comes at the beginning, but rather something that will need to be learned or acquired over time as the local governments are practicing to become effective borrowers. I think we're running out of time, so I'm just going to leave it at that for now for the comments on the borrowing, and now want to change gear a little bit, which is well, as you know, the local Public Sector Alliance and also, of course, the working groups, different thematic and regional working groups that the Alliance offers, including this one here on subnational finance. We're all member-based organization or member-based associations, and so we want to make sure that the issues that we discuss here and that bring to the table and we present to you are issues that are interesting and relevant for all the LPSA members. And so to that effect, we also want to give a chance to you and open the floor up to all the participants to kind of, spend the last, what do we have, like 10 minutes or so, maybe 15 if you're willing to stay a little bit over, to give a chance to you to bring up topics that you think are relevant, like related to subnational finance. What are the questions that have been burning under your fingernails? What are the issues that puzzle you? What are the topics that you feel are bubbling up and becoming really important in international debate, but haven't been cracked yet and are worth discussing here in this forum? So yes, I would just want to open up the floor to all of you to make suggestions for issues. Also, if you have something, for example, that from your own experience that you feel you have that is worth sharing as something interesting that you've learned that you know haven't seen before, then and that you think would be interesting to discuss in this forum, then please also do mention that. We are very curious to hear your inputs and hope that we'll be able to take that into consideration for the next our quarterly meetings of this working group that we're planning and curating as we go along. So I don't know if there are already some ideas. I have 3 messages. Let me check. Yeah. Feel free to raise your hand if you want to speak, or you can put your question or suggestion in the chat.
May I come with a question?
Please.
Comment. The point is that in the last 30 years, I've been working on this field. The IFIs, World Bank, Bilateral, GIZ, and others have tried almost everything possible or mentioned today. One of the frustration is that there is very little progress. And I think, so we are running around a vicious circle, because if there is no local market, it is difficult for the cities to borrow. If the cities are not creditworthy, they cannot borrow. And I think one of the issues which we need to see, and particularly regarding your paper, what are the specific core principles we need to look at? And David pointed several of them. One of them that only creditworthy city or creditworthy project should be supported for the market. And if the governments or IFIs try to break this rule, the success will be limited or temporary. So, and in this context, I like to underline one of the David point, that basically we need to look at creditworthiness of the city. Some IFIs were great, okay, let's make rating, but nothing changed after that, because a rating, when all the other conditions are left out, it is not helpful. So need to look at cities that are creditworthy and need to look at projects. So in case some creditworthy city might select project which is not creditworthy, therefore it is a built-in failure. Likewise, there are non-creditworthy cities with ring fence and special structured financing would be able to structure a creditworthy project. So I think this is one of the areas which we need to work a little bit more. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Point well taken. Well, now there are some other comments in the chat. Jadesola says the issue of fiscal federalism is critical. It is highly political and important to sustain subnational financing. How can LPSA help? Yeah, that's a very good question. Do you want to elaborate on this, Jadesola, or just leave it at this?
Yes, thank you, Gundula. In our space in Nigeria, no subnational or local government is allowed to take loan directly. You have to go through the central government. And in a situation where there is not much of a fiscal federalism, whereby states are restricted to transfers and whatever they can generate, and the transfer more often is from petroleum income from sale of crude and other intergovernmental transfers. What eventually comes to the states is not enough even to do projects. I know they might want to take on loans, but they don't have that fiscal space to take loans directly. They still have to go through the central government, which may not really come true. You understand? The issue of fiscal federalism is an issue because states are not allowed to manage their resources. If some of them are allowed to manage their resources, they can have enough. So if we can hone in on fiscal federalism, some states may be buoyant to take on loans with little effort. Thank you. So before then, I'm just thinking, how can LPSA support that kind of argument? I know it's political and it's within the legal frameworks. What can we do? How much advocacy we can make to bring this out? And thank God David is around, David Nabena. I think he can lend credence to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jadesola.
Mm-hmm.
Deborah, you have your hand up.
Hi again. So bear with me, I'm going to be a little bit high level here to try to connect three separate things that have, two of which have been part of the discussion today. So what we see at the biggest, broadest level in the international development work right now is this push towards addressing global challenges. So this question of how are we going to change the structure and the organization of international finance to help address issues such as climate change, pandemic type stuff, fragility and conflict. So there's a push upwards to sort of broader frameworks. At the same time, most of the services and the things that are needed and required to deliver support to those areas are done at the regional, if not the local city level delivery of the services that can help address some of those problems. David pointed out the importance of market-based solutions and also the importance of private finance. And that's also where the big picture world is going. They're saying, look, there's a certain amount of public finance that may be available, but everybody's sort of pulling back into their own shells. So we really need to figure out how we're going to raise private money to meet the needs out there. And so, as we've discussed in the session today, how do you create an environment where not only central, but regional, metro, and local levels of government can tap into private sources of finance, be they bonds or be they particular lending or be they through equity investment of some sort. And then finally, there's the question that we've talked a little bit around today, which is that of capacity. And the learning by doing of cities. How do you build creditworthiness? How do you think of ways in which to do that? What we haven't talked a lot about today is the role of citizens and civic engagement in terms of how citizens and society have to learn and accept and pressure accountability in some sense. So Paul alluded to it a little bit. So in kind of thinking out of the box in terms of how do we construct a forward agenda that might help resolve or to help make more or different progress than we've made over the past couple of decades, maybe stepping back a little bit as a working group and saying, okay, what is the role of subnational finance in cities in addressing and confronting some of these global crises? How do we bring together different pieces of what we've learned about the ways in which different subnationals have been effective in attracting private finance in one form or another. And that's just ended well in some places and badly in others. And in some countries, it's done both, right? You know, it's complicated. And then this question of how do you work with both state and civil society or society more broadly to sort of nudge along and build that capacity. It's an iterative process. It's not easy, it's hard, but thinking about how those forces interact, again, it's even more complicated here because we're talking about different levels of state government. So subnationals interact with feds in a very different way, as well as many people will know already. So those are just some sort of abstract, broad reflections on the work of the group and where we might think about addressing issues to see if we can, you know, get at the coalface a little bit more and maybe make some progress. So hope those are helpful, a little bit random, but my 2 cents worth.
Thank you very much, Debbie. No, indeed, very interesting. And yeah, very not easy, as you say, but I think, yeah, very, very important, because I think these, yeah, the fact that we've been looking at these issues in an isolated way without really thinking about connecting them properly is probably one of the reasons why we've been turning in circles and not really getting anywhere. So this is definitely worthwhile thinking about more. We have 2 more comments in the chat, which I will just read out in the interest of time. So one from Antonio is how do we mobilize private sector resources for financing subnational government projects? Yeah, that's very good. It's a very good question. That's worthwhile sort of thinking a bit more about more carefully. And then from Grace, can you share the models or framework used for building weak subnational government towards credit-worthy governments, and if the research includes low-income countries? Yes, I think this is also an interesting question to see how local governments can be sort of helped along the way to build this creditworthiness and incentivized also to build this creditworthiness when they don't already have it. So again, very good suggestion. Thank you very much for those. We will take those into consideration as we sort of think about future topics. But I mean, you know, not all of this working group will be dedicated to just the borrowing aspects or private finance, as Jamie pointed out at the beginning. This forum also looks at subnational, at intergovernmental transfers, at own source revenue generation, at spending at the subnational level. So you can expect some of the future working group sessions to also focus on these issues. Now, Jamie has asked me to say, yeah. Yes, let you know that the video of this meeting will be made available soon on the decentralization.net website. And you can also sign up for the page and for subsequent meetings scheduled for December, as well as March and June. Yes, so our next, we meet quarterly as a working group, or we'll have these type of events quarterly. So please keep an eye out for the next one coming, I think, on December 6th, if I'm not mistaken, and then on March 6th, and in June, I think it was a slightly different date. But anyway, you will all find all this information announced on the LPSA website, decentralization.net, and we look forward to seeing you there in the coming meetings. Please be in touch in the meantime if you have any ideas or suggestions or questions that you would like to see discussed, or interesting experiences you want to see shared. And yeah, now all is left for me is to say thank you very much for joining this this inaugural meeting of the Subnational Finance Working Group of LPSA. Very happy to have you had an interesting discussion. I'm very grateful for all your comments and questions and inputs and interest. And yes, looking forward to seeing you next time. In the name of my co-chairs, I also thank you for that. And yeah, have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.